Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to have this conversation. It's a conversation about Chile's constitution with Dr. Catherine Reyes-Householder. Dr. Reyes-Householder is a assistant professor at the Instituto de Ciencia Política at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. She's also an associate researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies, where she contributes to the center's interdisciplinary research on gender and elites. She previously was a postdoctoral fellow sponsored by FONDECI, which is the Chile's National Science Foundation, and an associate researcher at the Universidad Diego Portales. Her work on the presidency and gender has appeared in many places: comparative politics, PRQ, electoral studies, politics and gender, politics, groups and identities, Latin American Policy Society, Journal of Political Politics in Latin America. And she has also published book chapters on this topic, on elites in presidency, in several edited volumes at Oxford University Press, Temple University Press, and Palgrave. Again, I'm super excited. Catherine and I, we researched very similar things. And I joke that, like, whatever I study about Brazil, Catherine does better for all of Latin America in a comparative perspective. So it's always fun to have a conversation with her. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Dr. Catherine Reyes-Householder.
Okay, great. So I will start to share my screen, part of my screen. Here we go. Thank you, Pedro, for that super nice introduction. And just so that everyone knows, I'm a big fan of Pedro dos Santos' work. So he does awesome work, and I feel honored to be invited to talk to you guys today about Chile's constitutional process. So, you know, this sort of started in 2020, and I guess that's debatable because as I'll show you guys today, the history of Chile's constitutional process goes way back before 2020. And when this will end, we don't know. We're still in the middle of it. So that's why we have the question mark at the end for Chile's constitutional process. Okay, so here's the agenda. I just have sort of a list of questions that I want to touch on with you guys for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. I just want to first talk about, you know, why in general our constitution is important. How did Chile's constitutional process start? How did we sort of get into this very intense moment? And what was the constitutional process, at least the first rendering that we had, what was it like writing the new constitution? And why did Chileans reject the new constitution? There's a lot of debate about that, and some sort of consensus sort of arising, but mostly we're deeply debating that here in Chile. And what lays it for the future, that as well is very uncertain. So the last question is mostly conjectures and some potential possibilities that literally could change tomorrow. So, so we're on the edge of our seats in that sense. So why are constitutions important? So you guys are political science students. You're taking political science classes. Does anyone want to like throw out a little bit of some kind of notion of, you know, why constitutions are important? Feel free to raise your hand or jump in. And there's.
Yeah, I can start. Oh, sorry. I can kick us off. Sorry, I was just finishing eating. So great presentation so far. And the reason why constitutions are important is because they provide the legislative groundwork for society. It's common principles that everyone can agree on, regardless of which side you're on. So.
Great. Does everyone agree on the constitutional principles, on the legislative principles? Thanks, Nicholas, for starting us off. Any other ideas on why constitutions are important?
I think they also provide some legitimacy for the government.
Oh, okay. So wait, so Nicholas didn't say it. Who spoke just now? Who was that?
That was me.
Oh, BBIZAL. Okay, Braden. Great. Now, could you repeat your answer? I'm sorry, just one more time, because I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah, I said constitutions provide some legitimacy for the government.
Yeah. Okay. Ideally, right, the constitutions would be viewed as legitimate. Okay. Awesome. Somebody else? Maybe just one more person. These are all great ideas.
Could it be maybe that they provide some sort of groundwork for like lower governments, maybe like state or county level at the United States? I'm not really sure how it looks in Latin America though.
Right. That was Cullen. Great. Yes. So awesome. All of that's relevant. So they're, the most important laws of the country, which I think Nicholas was talking about and Cullen sort of mentioned too. So these are the most basic laws, and you derive other laws from these constitutional laws. But they're also, constitutions can sort of define what a country is, what a nation is, their national identity. Who are we? How are we going to make decisions? Okay, we're 15 million people down here in Chile. How are we going to make decisions about what's law, and how do we conceive of justice? How do we ensure justice, et cetera? Okay, so political scientists like to think of constitutions as distributing power. So how are we going to make decisions? Who are the actors? That all has to do with how we distribute power. Okay, who are going to be the veto players? How much consensus do we need? Do we need total consensus? Do we need partial consensus, et cetera? So all of those are really great ideas. So I want to ask you, and so I know probably a lot of you guys are American or from the US, or maybe you're from different countries. Do you feel proud of your Constitution? Or do you think other people feel proud about the Constitution of their nation? If so, why or why not?
Yeah, I can kick this one off too. So I know at least in America, many people are very nationalistic, especially around the Bill of Rights and the DOI and the Constitution. For me personally, I think it's a bit outdated. It's time that we rewrote it. I like the original principle behind it, but just based on the racist history it's had and the controversy and how that relates to today, it's time to bring up a new one. It doesn't. The thinking of 300 years ago doesn't apply to today.
Okay, great. That's super interesting. Does someone else want to add to what Nicholas was saying or have alternative?
So I can add to that. Yeah, I agree exactly with what he said. It's pretty much like, I'm not really proud of it just because it's so vague that you can kind of bend it whichever way you want to, which the whole point of the Constitution is like it's supposed to be something you refer to solve issues.
Great. Thanks, Haley and Keely. Anyone else?
I mean, yeah, I can go again. I know that we're basically taught that the Constitution is like the end all be all, especially like when I was in lower school. Like we would do the Pledge of Allegiance like to the flag every day, and that really instills like, hey, we're going to follow the Constitution every single day. Whether or not I'm proud of it, I can't really say that I am, and I know that there's a lot of like ideological underbearing inside of like your interpretation of the Constitution. And honestly, should we have multiple sides of interpretation for one document in like national law? And honestly, I would say no. I would say that the ambiguity is there so like political elites can kind of manipulate it to their advantage. And I think that's why we haven't really gotten rid of it yet. And so for the common man, I would say it's probably not the best idea. And I would say I'm probably not proud of it. And we should probably do something in the future.
Yeah, so I asked this question just to sort of contrast, how the US Constitution is viewed by a lot of people, not only in the US, but the rest of the world too, as being this amazingly almost sacred document that's lasted for so long. It's been amended, quite a bit, but it's lasted so long, and it's minimalist, it's flexible. And of course, like there's some people who point to the racist origins, and people who would like to have more pro-women reforms or more feminist approach in the Constitution, et cetera. But there's a lot of people in the United States who feel very proud of their Constitution. That is not the case in Chile. There's very few people who are proud of the Constitution in Chile. So in the United States, you have the founding fathers, who are sort of viewed as gods. We don't have the equivalent of that in Chile. And I'll sort of explain why in the next, throughout this presentation. So how did this constitutional process start in Chile? I would say that the best take on this is by Claudia Reyes, who's an assistant professor at the Universidad de Chile. She's a member of the Red de Politólogas, which is this women's female political scientists group. She's also a member of COES. And she is a specialist. There's many specialists, but she's one of the top specialists on the Chilean Constitution here. And she wrote a book, a very short book. It's available on Kindle. Why do we need a new constitution? ¿Por qué necesitamos una nueva constitución? And she wrote it in the heat of 2019, 2020, and it came out before we really started this process. Here she sort of lays out sort of the reasoning why Chile needs a new constitution. So first of all, before I get into how did this, what is happening with the constitutional process, we have to go back to how did this all begin. So in 1973, you guys might have heard, because you're taking this Latin American politics course, there was a coup d'etat in Chile led by this military dictator, Augusto Pinochet. During the first 5 years of his dictatorship, there was a constitutional commission that wrote a very long document of the Constitution, a new Constitution, to replace the old one, which was from 1925. So this Constitution was pretty weird in many, many ways. One of the ways was that it afforded enormous presidential power. So this made sense because we were having a military dictatorship, and so the dictator wanted to give himself a lot of power. Okay, that sort of makes sense. And it turned Chile into sort of this hyper presidentialist regime in this Constitution. The other really strange thing about this Constitution was how it enshrined neoliberalism. Have you guys heard of neoliberalism? Did you talk about it in class? Does anyone want to throw out a little definition of neoliberalism?
Washington consensus, kind of free market economics.
Right. And the Washington consensus came a little bit after this. This was even before. So we're talking free market capitalism. We're talking deregulation, thinking about reducing the state, letting private interests have a lot of power in the economy and in society and stuff. So one of the strangest things about this Constitution was the way that it enshrined neoliberalism. And the way that it was, for example, phrased is that parents have the right to choose their school. So in the United States, in some parts of the United States, there's these voucher programs. Chile became the first country in the world, and I think maybe still the only country in the world, to have a voucher system in the entire country. Okay, so it's the right of parents to choose their schools. It's the right of individuals to choose their healthcare. It's the right of individuals to choose their pension fund. Okay, and so all of that kind of sounds nice. Okay, you have a lot of rights to choose things, but one of the main problems is with that is you can't establish a universal healthcare system similar to what they have in England. It limits the ability of the education system to reduce inequality, and you have lots of inequality being replicated through education system. Who can choose where to send their kids? Well, it kind of depends on how much money you can spend as well on your private education. So low-income families, for example, they go to the public school. They can choose which public school, but none of them are as good as the private schools, which you could only access if you have money. As well as the pension funds as well. So that depends on how much money you earn. And a lot of low income or informal workers do not pay into their pension funds, and Chile has very low pensions, et cetera. So this was a very strange constitution that Pinochet and not him really, but elites in the military dictatorship wrote. They had a sham plebiscite in 1980. So here's an example of how they voted. So now I can't even, you basically had to say sí or no, right? Do you want this new constitution, or yes or no? 66% said yes, but of course we know people were voting twice. We know that there was a lot of, this was not a democratic election, okay? This was not a democratic plebiscite. So then we have like a series of events that sort of lead us up into this social uprising, this constitutional process that we're referring to now. So 1988, they had another referendum. Do you want Pinochet to stay in power? The no won. 1990, we have elections and then transition to democracy. And in that period, they did modify the constitution in certain things, slightly limiting presidential power. 2005, we have some major constitutional reforms, so many constitutional reforms that the president at the time, Ricardo Lagos, signs the constitution and says, this is a new constitution, okay? This didn't satisfy, though, everyone, right? This was part of a process of negotiating with the conservative forces in the right. 2013, you had this Marca AC campaign. So, 2013. 2013, you have a presidential election. So here's what the ballot looked like. You could vote for all these presidential candidates. For example, you could vote for Michelle Bachelet to win a re-election. And then the campaign wanted you to write AC on your ballot. And the AC was for Asamblea Constituyente. So this was to show public support, popular support across the country for a new constitutional process with a constitutional assembly. So I think about like 9% of votes came in with this people writing AC on them. And it was a big national campaign. It was sort of viewed as a success. Michelle Bachelet, comes to power and she starts a constitutional process from the top down. They get a draft of a new constitution and nothing happens in Congress. Okay, so Congress, there's no political will to change the constitution. 2018, there's a wave of feminism, which may seem unrelated, but I'll relate it to the gender parity part of our constitutional convention later on. But you have university students, women taking the streets. It's the biggest wave of feminism basically since the 1980s. So the third or fourth wave of feminism in Chile, and they're hitting the streets, asking for non-sexist education. Okay, so we have in 2019, the social uprising. So how did this start? It's sort of what was the trigger? Okay, so there's this special technical committee that decided that the metro needed to raise its price by like 4 cents. Okay, so it costs the dollar's really strong now, so it costs way less than $1 to ride the metro, and it's a very nice metro system here in Santiago. And they raised the price by 4 cents. These high school students start protesting in the metro, as you can see here, jumping over the turnstiles, as we're not going to pay. Interestingly, it wasn't even the university students who had to pay more because they have a special price that's like 25 cents or something to ride the metro. It's very inexpensive to ride the metro if you're a university student, but they were protesting on behalf of everyone else, right, who had to have this 4 cent change. Things explode, okay? And October 25th, you have the biggest march in Chile, literally called the biggest march in Chile. 1.2 million people in the streets. You also have this phrase come out, Chile despertó, okay, Chile woke up, okay? And so this phrase sort of encapsulates this idea of like Chileans gaining consciousness of the social inequality, of the unfairness of the healthcare system, the unfairness of the pension system, the education system, the environmental rights, environmental movements, all of these, issues sort of piling up. And it was sort of thought to be like the moment when Chileans finally realized like we can't take it anymore. there was a lot of violence. And so here's like an image of the metro being burned, and it's and so the metro is in Santiago, and it's sort of a symbol, I would say, of Chile's success and modernity. It's very clean, very efficient, and to see it burned was pretty traumatic for a lot of people in Santiago and people the rest of Chile as well. And they burned buses. So how do you think Chileans solved or addressed the social uprising?
Did the military respond back with some sort of violent like takedown kind of thing, like akin to what happened in Minneapolis when people started getting protesting violently? Did they try to put them down basically?
Yes. Well, we started to have curfew, and so so it was sort of, I guess the translation would be a state of exception, where basically, I'm trying to remember, we had to be in by like 8 p.m. or even earlier. And so there was looting, and so the military had to come into the streets and calm things down. Yes, that was like the immediate action on the part of the president to handle this. How else was this solved or addressed? So we had something that was kind of cool. At least it was thought to be really cool at the moment. A big relief. All the political parties came together and they said, we're going to have an agreement about peace. And so mid-November, they come together for Acuerdo de la Paz. And essentially, literally, it was all the leaders of the political parties. I'm trying to think, the communists rejected this and said it was all, it was too elitist or something. But the main political parties, including, you might notice this guy right here, Gabriel Boric, our current president, came together and they said, we need to have a political way of getting out of this. So not just the military shutting everything down, not just having curfew, okay, we have to have like some kind of political agreement on how we're going to solve these massive problems. And so they came together and they wrote up this document, Agreement for Social Peace and a New Constitution. Okay, so some people viewed the social uprising as all about these inequality. You know, there's people protesting about the pension system, they're protesting about the metro fare hikes, they're protesting about environmental issues or indigenous rights. But many people viewed all of that as sort of related to constitutional problems in Chile, right? And so the political class came together and they said, okay, we're going to start a constitutional process. We're going to rewrite the Constitution. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to ask the Chilean public if they actually want to do this. So they designed a plebiscite, and this is all detailed in this agreement in mid-November. They said, we're going to have a plebiscite. It was actually, I'm thinking it was supposed to be in April 2020, but because of the pandemic, they had to move it back. A lot of this constitutional process was affected by the pandemic. Postponing elections, postponing the plebiscite. So basically they said, okay, we're going to have a plebiscite and we're going to ask the Chilean public, do you want a new constitution? Do you approve or do you reject? If, okay, so this was the first ballot. And then they also received a second ballot. Okay, and the second ballot asked what kind of institution do you want to write this new constitution? Do you want it to be part Congress and partly elected, or do you just want the whole constitutional body to be elected? Okay. So Apruebo won overwhelmingly. Okay, in this plebiscite, 78%. That was pretty clear. Okay, 22% said we don't want to start a new constitutional process. We just want to stay with our new constitution and maybe reform it or something like that. And then what kind of institution do you want? I'm sorry, this is incorrect. This should say the Constitutional Convention got 79% and the mixed got 21%. So 79% of Chileans said, we want this whole constitutional body to be directly elected. We want to elect these constituents, okay, who are the constitutional members. Okay, so, oh my gosh, what is this supposed to look like then? How are we supposed to have this new body, constitutional body, writing a constitution? How is this going to be? So there's a lot of similarities between the Constitutional Convention and what Congress looks like. So the constituent elections looked a lot like legislative elections. So they elected 155 people, and it was based on your region where you live. So these are all based on the districts in Chile. One of the differences between how you elect people in Congress, in the Chilean Congress, and how we elected people for this Constitutional Convention was that this Constitutional Convention was gender parity. So that meant that you had these lists of candidates, and at the top of the list were all women. And then you had a woman, and then you had a man, and then you had a woman, and then a man, right? And once they tallied up the votes, they did a certain kind of correction that enabled it to have basically 50-50 women and men. So that was viewed as being a great advance compared to, for example, how we elect Congress people in Chile. In fact, it was the first constitutional convention in the world that featured gender parity. Another difference was that we had reserved seats for indigenous groups. So one of the social movements in Chile has to do with indigenous rights. And so in order for the constitutional process to be viewed as legitimate, many people argue that we have to have reserved seats for indigenous groups in order for their interests to be represented as well. And that was unprecedented in Chile. Everything they made this rule to had to be approved by 2/3 of the body. So once the Constitutional Convention is elected, and once they start to form their own regulations, everything that's going to be in this new constitutional proposal has to be approved by at least 2/3, which was viewed as a pretty high threshold for getting something approved. So there was a lot of emphasis, okay, on this whole process, we're going to do it democratically, it's going to be gender parity, we're going to have indigenous reserved seats, and we're going to have a lot of consensus. And how do we achieve this? With the 2/3 rule. Okay, and so there was campaigning during the pandemic, and these were sort of the results. So briefly, Vamos por Chile basically represents the right. Okay, they only got about 21%. Most people thought that they would get 1/3. Okay, so this meant that the right did not have that needed third to be able to veto things that it didn't like. This was probably the most important, or one of the most important results of this constituent election, which was in May of 2021. Apretable Dignidad was like the left, and they got less than the right. Okay, so like 19%. Then we had Lista de la Prueba, which was like the center left, and they got about 15%. We had independents, a lot of independents. So Chileans hate political parties, very different from the United States, where in the United States, you have a lot of people who feel Democrat or feel Republican. It's polarized, but people feel that way. In Chile, people don't feel like anything. They just don't like political parties at all. And so the independents got a lot of votes. Right? So the independents, obviously, they don't have an affiliation with a political party. And they had a very strong showing. Who are these independents? They could be leaders of social movements. They could be like journalists. They could just be different media personalities. They had different ways of like getting votes. And then we also had this kind of another very unusual group called the List of the People. Okay, so during this whole social uprising and during the constitutional process, there was a lot of talk about what the people want. Okay, la gente, la gente, la gente. So they came up with this list. It's not exactly a political party, but it was a list that competed in this election that was literally called, the people. Who do we represent? The people. Okay, they did really well. We did not expect them to do so well. They did. They got 16%. We didn't expect. And again, these people these are non-traditional political actors. I don't know, teachers, again, social movements, leaders, et cetera, people that nobody had ever heard of. But they're part of, they were saying that they were representing the people, and they got a lot of votes. Another part of this process that was pretty cool, at least from a gender perspective, was that, as I mentioned, that feminist wave happened just 1 year before the social uprising. So there was a lot of consensus that the president of the Constitution needed to be a woman. Okay, and so this is before they chose the president, but they had all these, leading women, who could be the president. Well, it ended up being Elisa Loncon. He was the first woman president of the convention. So the convention had to get together, and they met for the first time on July 4th, 2021, in the ceremony. And one of the first things they had to do was to elect their president and elect their vice president. So she's an indigenous leader. She's actually an intellectual, a professor at the University in Santiago. Here she's dressed in traditional clothes, and was sort of the symbol of the convention from the very beginning. And then you have Jaime Bassa, a dude, right? He's a constitutional expert, and he has been working on constitutional issues in Chile for many, many, many years. Also a professor. So we had a lot of academics in that sense in the constitutional process. So what was this like? It was kind of like a parallel Congress, in that they had lots and lots of different commissions. So here's just some of the commissions that they had. They had to get together for about the first 3 months. They had to simply design rules and regulations. How are we going to organize ourselves? And so they organized themselves in terms of topics. Some of the topics, like fundamental rights, had all these subcommissions because it was such a big thing to tackle. They had commissions on communication, information, transparency, participation, indigenous consultation, popular participation, et cetera. Okay, a lot of many commissions, maybe about 30, I think. They wrote this preamble, and this is not a good translation. We the people of Chile, but here they're saying the women first, nosotras first, okay? And then they say nosotros, which is the masculine, which you don't capture that in the translation. The people of Chile, conform to diverse nations, we're made up of various nations. We freely grant ourselves constitution, and it's based on these principles of participation, okay? Now, this is not a good translation. Paridad refers to gender parity. So basically it's participatory, gender equality, and democratic process. This was like part of the preamble. This constitution is very, very, very long. It's longer than the 1980 Constitution, way longer than the US Constitution. The US Constitution is minimalist. And as maybe Nicholas or Colin was saying, is subject to lots of different interpretations. This constitution had the characteristic of being maximalist, so it tried to touch everything. Okay, we had a referenda or a plebiscite, I guess you would say, or no, a referendum, I guess you would say, on this on September 4th, exactly a month ago. It seems like a long time ago, just a month ago. If you apruebo or rechazo, does anyone remember, approve or disapprove of the constitutional proposal? Does anyone remember what happened?
Yeah, it got voted down pretty harshly, didn't it?
Pretty harshly. Yeah. 62%. So basically, most polls showed rechazo winning, like a couple months before the plebiscite, but nobody thought it would be that big of a margin. It was a really big margin, very decisive. And the other thing was that in this election, unlike the previous elections, participation was obligatory. So everyone had to vote. So the participation got up to 85%. For these elections that I mentioned before, when we elected the constitutional body, that election 43% participation, like half the number of people voted in that one. The one when this plebiscite that I mentioned at the beginning was 51% participation, which people thought was really, really good. Wow, 51%, that's really, really good because this is voluntary. And then we thought, 43%, not too bad. It could be worse. But then we get to this, and it's 85% of Chileans participating. Okay, so this was viewed as obviously a huge defeat for the Constitutional Convention, and in some ways for the current president and the current administration that we have. Why do you guys think this Constitution was rejected?
Was it because the progressives in Chile were more willing to go out and vote versus maybe the more conservatives who were more willing to stay home and just stick with the status quo?
Well, if the conservatives stayed home and wanted to stick with the status quo, I would think that they would approve of the new Constitution because the new Constitution would change the status quo. So somebody else have some other ideas, but that's a good guess. Did anyone hear any ideas of why they, you went through all this trouble. You went through all this trouble to do the first plebiscite. We had these elections. We had to have these 155 people, give them resources for 9 months to write something. And then why would Chile reject it? Seems like a big waste of time. That's okay.
Was it because the new Constitution was too liberal?
Okay.
So then like conservatives, old school conservatives voted against it?
Okay, interestingly, liberal in Chile actually means like the opposite in the United States. So when we think of liberal in the United States, you think of progressive, right? So it's true that people rejected the new Constitution. One interpretation is that it was too progressive. And so I don't know if you remember when I mentioned the neoliberal term. So when you talk about liberal in like the Chilean context, you actually think of the conservatives because it's those people who might be more neoliberal as well. So exactly, yeah. So a lot of people thought, whoa, this is a little bit too wild. It's a little bit too progressive and radical. I'm not comfortable with all these changes. Let's just reject. Does anyone else have any other ideas?
I think I read a little bit. I believe it's because they also didn't have as much, I don't want to say issues or kind of like, I guess I would say motions in place for like indigenous communities. It wasn't too much emphasis on that, or they weren't in place. I think I remember reading something about that.
Great. Yes. So the indigenous rights was a huge, how do I say, point of controversy in the Constitution. Absolutely. So it's too progressive. Indigenous rights, I'm not comfortable with either. Anyone else? I think that was Brenda. Thanks, Brenda. One more person?
Like you mentioned, it wasn't written by like politicians or political scientists, so there could have been some concern that the government wouldn't have functioned effectively.
Yeah, they were all novices. They didn't know what they were doing. Who were were these people anyway? We elected to write the new constitution. All of that's, thank you. All of that's relevant. So I think what Brenda was saying, so as I mentioned in the preamble, Chile was the preamble of the Constitution talked about Chile being made up of diverse nations. So there's this idea of plurinacionalidad, okay? So throughout the proposal of the new Chilean Constitution, there was this idea that we have to recognize the indigenous groups and their autonomous, and that we're not just one nation, we're multiple nations, and we need to recognize that. So the Chilean public, one of the reasons why the Constitution was rejected had to do with this idea of like, Chile should just be one nation. And so there's this uncertainty or rejection of this idea of Chile being multiple nations, and Chile giving rights, new rights and more significant rights to indigenous groups. So some people would say that, I'm comfortable with being a multicultural country, and we can have a multicultural, but we don't want to be plurinational. Okay, we don't want to be various nations. We just want to be one nation, but give the indigenous people, the rights that they need and deserve and things like that. So you have to remember in Chile too, there's sort of the idea of, Bolivia is plurinacional. Okay, and so a lot of people in Chile, for better or worse, think we don't want to be Bolivia. Okay, they also think we don't want to be Venezuela. We don't want to be too progressive. We don't want to be communist or socialist, whatever. As well. So some people interpret this as sort of a racist reaction as well. It could be interpreted that way. And I think a lot of future studies on this should be talking about, this idea of rejection of plurinacionalidad. There's also this idea that it was too radical of a national refounding, and this is sort of related to the progressive comment that it's too progressive. So for example, they eliminated the Senate. They didn't really eliminate the Senate. They just gave it a new name and different attributes. But many people saw some of the changes in the new constitution as, this is too much change. Let's just have more gradual change or more moderate change that more people can agree on. The content was too left-wing. What somebody else was saying, these constitutional people were unprofessional. They didn't know what they were doing. They did sloppy work. And this is a bad draft. This is poorly written, okay? Some people also thought that maybe because President Gabriel Boric, who was, as you remember, part of that constitutional process, signing that document back in November 2019, he later wins the election, right, in December 2021. Some people, and Boric is viewed as always being in favor of this constitutional process. He's a left-wing president. And so because people didn't like Boric, they thought, I'm going to reject this constitution that Boric is for. Okay, that's another possibility. Some people say Chileans didn't actually know what they were voting for. They didn't actually read the Constitution. They didn't. Now, let me tell you, how many people read the Constitution? I don't think that many. Okay, but I also don't think that it's necessary to read the whole thing to make an informed decision about it. But so this is an unlikely thing that Chileans did not know what they were voting for. It's sort of an elitist argument, not very likely. Some people thought, Chileans to reject the new constitution because of all this fake news. And it's true that there was fake news out saying, if you approve this new constitution, they're going to take away your house. Or if you approve this constitution, we're going to become, I don't know, like Venezuela. Different kinds of fake news, okay? But it's unlikely that so many Chileans would be persuaded by these lies that it actually made it 62% rejected this as well. So that's unlikely. Okay, all of those are possibilities though, we don't really know. But I think one of the strongest arguments for this relates to the plurinacionalidad. It relates to it's too progressive, it's too much change. The right, before we voted, if we wanted to approve or disapprove, reject the new constitution, the right was saying, okay, just reject, but we'll still continue the constitutional process. We'll still get a new constitution because we know that 70% of the Chileans said they want a new constitution. So the right, which has always embraced the current constitution for the historical reasons that I mentioned with Augusto Pinochet, et cetera. The right had always opposed constitutional reforms. So the few constitutional reforms that were, well, they were significant, that were achieved before this, the right had always opposed and tried to stop or break these constitutional reforms, put the brake on the constitutional reforms. But now, in a sudden change of heart, right, the right is saying, okay, we're going to continue this constitutional process, vote reject, so that we'll have a better constitution. So that was the main selling point of the reject, which also helps explain why it did so well, because the right said, we will get you something even better. This is sloppy, this is messy, and it doesn't unite people. We're going to figure out something that's better written and that will unite Chileans. So what are the possibilities? We could have a new plebiscite, but I don't think that's necessary. I mean, not me, but I think that a lot of political elites don't think that's necessary. We could do the whole thing again, have the same kind of elections, but this time with obligatory voting. So instead of 43% of people voting, let's get up to 85. The right has pushed really hard for, let's get experts, let's elect experts, or let's appoint experts, and they're going to become, really more important actors this time around. Now, this is not to say, I don't want to give the impression that the previous Constitutional Convention didn't have experts. It had a lot of lawyers, a lot of constitutional experts, a lot of academics as well were elected, right, to this body. So it's not as if the previous Constitutional Convention, they really didn't know what they were doing in a lot of senses. Other people say, we don't need a new constitution, let's just reform. Let's just reform. And that's basically what Chileans have been doing for the past 30 years, these small reforms that the right has always tried to stop. We can do nothing. it could be, we spent a couple years, wasted our time for a couple years, and now let's just do nothing and try to get back to the main problems in Chile, which is, poverty, which is, the quality education, achieving quality education, et cetera. Constitutional reforms are not so important. What people really care about are these basic everyday problems. Okay, so that's what the right would say as well. All these are possibilities. There's even more possibilities I haven't talked about, but I'm out of time. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Yeah, let me just start off. Thank you with your excellent presentation. It's really nice to see someone that knows Chilean politics talk about it. So thank you so much for doing that. One of my questions is were you surprised by the results that did end up happening? And just based off of regional history, do you think a new constitution will be propositioned? Where do you see it going? Not just the general scientific community.
So we have pretty good polling in Chile. So if you looked at the polls, pretty much in May of this year showed that reject was looking likely to win. But I think a lot of people were sort of in denial that this really could happen, because the idea was, how could 78% vote for this, have a new constitutional process? How could so many people, and these were democratic elections, all of these were super democratic. We had a process when they had to get 2/3 to get approved into the new constitution. That requires a lot of consensus in the convention. How is it then that we could come to the point where people would actually reject it? So even on the eve of the election, September 2nd, September 3rd, some people were still, some people, I'll say, be more specific, progressive elites, okay, we're thinking, maybe this could really pull through. No, it was a huge margin, and for all the reasons that I laid out. And so I follow the polls, and it didn't seem likely. So what was surprising was the margin. So actually the polls showed that rechazo, reject, would win, but they didn't predict by that big of a margin. So that was an underestimation of the support for reject. And we also didn't think that 85% would participate. We were thinking like maybe 75% of Chileans would go to vote. 85% was huge, which was a victory for democracy, right? It was a victory that we got so many people out to vote. That was across the board. People were happy with that. And I think that we'll stay with obligatory voting in Chile because that's so important to get people's preferences are the voting population who would go to vote in any election versus the number of people who only vote in obligatory elections. Their preferences are different. So if we really want to get everyone's opinion, we have to make it obligatory. So one of the amazing things, right after that was, the right, led by the UDI, right? The president comes out and he said, we're gonna stick with what we said before the plebiscite. This was a huge victory for the reject, but we still want a new constitution. And so that was great, that the right, continued to say we still want a new constitution, and they still seem to be following through. There's lots of disagreements on, how to proceed, all the nitty gritty of, how if we have elections, what's going to be the electoral system that we're going to use. Most people think that we would have gender parity, but we don't think that we're going to have so many reserved seats for Indigenous groups, because some of the Indigenous groups were very, very small and they had like 1 seat or whatever. But it was highly criticized. Yeah, so the one of the issues too is that, we're running against the clock here. So our electoral organization that organizes elections said, we cannot have elections before the end of the year. You guys want elections? We at least have to wait until March or April next year. So that would be the soonest that we could have any elections if possible. What seems to be pretty clear too is that there would be a bigger role for experts, which is generally thought to be people with PhDs or people who work at think tanks or people who have sort of a history of expertise in constitutional issues. But that's a whole nother issue. How do you define experts? And the conservatives have their favorite experts and progressives have their favorite experts. How do we decide who gets to participate? Some people, and again, it could just be that we were just run out of steam. But the major difference now is that we're, versus previously, when we had the social uprising, we had a conservative president, Piñera, who never was for this new constitutional process. Now we have a president, from the left, who's always supported a new constitution. He's been in politics probably for about 15 years and has always been for a new constitution in Chile. So that's a sign that things would advance in a sense.
Awesome, thank you.
Anyone else have any other questions?
And a reminder that the article that you read today was also written by Dr. Reyes-Householder. So any questions about that article as well? So we can start kind of bringing in both a conversation about the Constitution and this conversation about her research as well. I have a couple questions, but I want to hear from you all first, what you have. So again, either about what we're talking about Constitution now in Chile or about the research on women and candidates.
Yeah, I guess now that we're connecting it to the article that you wrote and that we read for class, another question I have too is, so compared to the US at least, gender is a big thing here, but you don't see it much often in politics because of how hyper-partisan politics is in the US. Does that exist within Chile? Does that level of polarization exist, or is everything still pretty amicable for the most part?
That's a really good question. And I sort of alluded to this before, but basically in the US, you have two major parties and it's polarized, as you guys know, and either you identify with, Democrats or Republicans. And you really don't, if you're Democrat, you really don't like the Republicans. And if you're Republican, you really don't like the Democrats. In Chile, very few people are members of political parties. It did not used to be that way. 30 years ago, people identified much more with political parties. They were much more active in political parties. And basically the past 3 decades, that has declined a lot. And so political, even the word political is sort of like a bad word. Like nobody wants to be political. If you're political, that's bad. It's good to be non-political or apolitical or independent. That's a good thing. So many people, for example, who used to identify with the center left in particular, no longer identify with the center left. And so Chile's presidents, from the 1990s up until 2010, were all from the center left, all of them. And then we had one center right president, and then center left again. But and people in those parties from the center left have really weakened, and you saw that in the constituent in the constitutional convention, that there was very few constitutional members who were from these center left parties. There were a lot more, independents, and also members of indigenous groups, people, constituents who were representing the people. So many people, experts in Chile, say there's no polarization in Chile. It's not a polarized society. It's a society where there's a lot of consensus that we don't like political parties and that we don't like the political establishment. And then if you see polarization in Chile, it's among the elites. It's among these political elites. So the communists, of course, don't like the far right. The far right doesn't like it. Sure, okay. But that's not representative of the broader Chilean population, which generally doesn't like political parties at all.
Thank you again.
Does anyone else have a question or a comment?
I'm gonna do a general call out to the women in the class. You had good points and opinions on the paper. You can literally just read them all out.
Gender.
You can literally just read them all out, and thinking about gender dynamics, even in this conversation, is important too. So think about that. Go back to your comments and see if there's anything that you can bring up here for our conversation.
When we think about gender, of course, we shouldn't just think about women, right? Some of the most fascinating gender analysis I think that go on in the U.S., have to do with understanding how Trump is hyper-masculinist, or different ways that men in politics use their gender to gain power as well. In Chile, in the last presidential election, so we had basically two guys, Gabriel Boric from the left and Jose Antonio Cast from the far right. And their leadership styles were very gendered. Both were men, right? But they had very gendered leadership styles, with Gabriel Boric, explicitly trying to adopt a more feminine, horizontal, empathetic leadership style. And Jose Antonio Cast from the far right, adopting this more authoritarian, kind of like Bolsonaro, top-down, conservative, stereotypically masculine leadership style. We saw that in the last election, but Boric ended up winning by a lot, but not just because of his leadership style, but because of other things as well. But there's an ideological correlate with gender and leadership in that sense.
I had a question. It doesn't really pertain to like women in American politics, but so I was kind of finding out what factors, in your opinion, what factors do you think could delay the introduction of a new Chilean constitution that would be widely accepted? Because I know indigenous rights was a huge thing. I think it was, I think it also spoke about abortion laws. And then I think another one was private property. But is there specific factors that you foresee that are going to be critical for the widely accepted Chilean constitution?
Well, that is a fantastic question, Brenda. And, some people would say that Chilean society is so disenchanted with politics that we're never going to come up with a constitution that satisfies everyone. Why? Because people who want the more minimalist constitution, let's just keep it short and simple, and then we'll figure out the rest through Congress, basically. That minimalist constitution doesn't satisfy a lot of the social actors in Chile. So these social movements really want to have a lot of indigenous rights. They really want to have a lot of say over the environment, and literally rights for the nature. The feminists really want to have, obviously, reproductive rights in the Constitution, and a lot of other measures, rights for domestic workers. You want to have gender parity throughout the whole government, the whole state. Everything should be gender parity. And so this is a real dilemma. In that sense, there is a big conflict between people who want just a short, simple, constitution. Let's just avoid the issues that divide us, versus these people who are very politically active and that say, we really need to get these rights in, or else they will not be guaranteed for us. So that, if Chile does go through another constitutional process, figuring out how to satisfy both camps is difficult. One of the ways that this can be addressed, in a sense, is that the process has to be legitimate. So before we even start the other process, we have to decide these are going to be the rules, and whatever comes out of these, this process, we should accept. Okay. So we may not have another plebiscite at the end. Okay. We may say, these are the rules, and then whatever this constitutional body decides, we're going to go for that. That's another possibility, to avoid this possibility of Chileans rejecting another constitution. But figuring out how to make this process legitimate, and if it's viewed as legitimate and you still don't like the content, that's democracy, right? Democracy is, having a process that everyone agreed on, and even if you don't like the fact that women have the right to abortion, you still have to go with it, because that's what resulted from the process of figuring things out. So being able to accept things that you don't like it's a basic principle of how democracy works, accepting defeats, and coming to some kind of consensus through negotiation. Did that answer your question, Brenda?
Yeah, I think it definitely clarified how I was thinking about it as well. Thank you.
Hey, Catherine, I had a more basic question, which I haven't taught comparative politics, in kind of comparing countries in a while, and I don't remember. So, what is Chilean's judicial tradition? So, is it more in line with the U.S., where is the interpretation by the Supreme Court, or is it more of a civil code tradition where there's still Supreme Court, but the interpretation is much more narrow to the writing and not to interpret the laws the way we kind of see in the United States? So can you explain a little bit about how, if it's similar or different to the United States?
Yeah, so I can just give you a superficial answer on that, because I'm not an expert on the judicial system. But essentially, Chile comes from a more Spanish tradition, so different from the UK and US tradition. And there were major reforms. There were major judicial reforms in this constitution proposal. And to be honest, they were hardly addressed. There were so many other debates eliminating the Senate. We had debates over, are we going to have a parliamentary regime? Are we going to have a presidentialist regime? There was a lot of people who thought we were going to go, we should have a parliamentary, or we should have a semi-presidentialist regime. We ended up sticking in the proposal with a presidentialist regime with less presidential power. People thought still that was too much change as well. But going back to the judicial issue, many people also thought we need to do something about the Supreme Court as well, and the Constitutional Court. So the Constitutional Court, historically has always defended the current Constitution. And that's been one of the things that's prevented reforms, is that the Constitutional Court often says this is not constitutional, this is not constitutional, this is not constitutional, preventing reforms that could enhance educational equality or healthcare equality or even consumer rights. So it is different from the U.S. Pedro, and I'm so sorry that I can't offer you a more a better answer.
That's why I asked you, because also it's not my thing either.
Yeah.
No, yeah, and by the way, in this class, like, we actually, just for your students' context too, like, we are really focusing more on the electoral aspects of it, institutional aspects on the electoral side of it.
Yeah.
So talking about parties, the president. So we are not talking about the judicial system as much.
Sure.
And again, part of it is because it's not my thing, and I don't want to get too far into something I cannot really fully explain later.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Now that I'm thinking, in comparative politics, there is much more emphasis on electoral institutions that are not necessarily judicial. Well, it's a reflection of the discipline as well.
Yeah, exactly. So okay, so I have a question for you about your research, and then hopefully it emboldens people to ask some questions too. So a very basic question, what led you to this study? And also, and maybe you can share a little bit with students too, that this was published in Comparative Politics, but you are also working on a bigger project about this as well. So let me talk a little bit about that, and then start with that, like, what led you to start studying candidates, beyond like just looking at who gets elected?
Right. Well, I mean, more of like a personal anecdote. So I came to Chile when I was like your guys' age. I was like 20. And when I came to Chile for the first time, it was in May of 2005. And I knew little. I knew there was Pinochet dictatorship, something like that. And I came, and it ended up being in the middle of a presidential campaign with two women competitors, Michelle Bachelet and Soledad Alvear. And so that was sort of the beginning of my interest in women presidential candidacies. Bachelet wins, right? And then she wins another election then after that. And then there's this wave of female presidents in Latin America. So you have in Argentina, Cristina Kirchner winning not once, but twice. You have Laura Chinchilla winning in Costa Rica. And then obviously Dilma Rousseff winning not once, but twice. And then, of course, as we know from Pedro's book, then she's impeached on very dubious grounds. But so that personal, so having that personal experience of seeing that, that bit of the campaign, I wasn't there for the election, just for the campaign, made me realize too that you can't just have one woman candidate. In that election in particular, you had two viable women candidates. So maybe what's important is not just winning, but actually having viable women candidacies. And you see that in countries that have elected women presidents, I think in Argentina, Brazil, and obviously Chile, you had multiple women who could have won the presidency. In Peru as well, Keiko Fujimori almost won. She lost by like a hair twice. And then in Brazil, obviously, Marina da Silva had the most important run besides Dilma Rousseff in 2010. In Argentina as well, you had Cristina Kirchner competing against another woman. She wins easily, Cristina does, but she was competing against a woman. And so maybe if we think, in the long term, how do we achieve, gender equality in presidential politics? Maybe we shouldn't look just at winners, but maybe we should also look at how do you even get like a good run at this? Well, basically for women, and this is less so for men, but especially for women, you got to get the nomination of a major political party. So unlike the US, most countries in Latin America have lots of political parties. And so many people become candidates of these tiny parties that have no chances of winning. Well, okay, I guess that's interesting. But if you're a woman, okay, and you really, in order to launch a viable candidacy, you got to be part of a major political party, because women, unlike men, never have won the presidency from a small party. this happens all the time with men. Bolsonaro wins from a tiny party. Hugo Chavez wins from nothing. In Peru, a country with no political parties, you had many men, create political parties and then win the presidency easily. That's never happened for women. Okay, so women actually had different pathways to power that are a little bit more dependent on these major political parties. And what do political parties offer? Campaign resources, money, infrastructure, volunteers, all of these things that you need to get your name out. And so that's, why would a major political party go for a woman instead of a man? So the argument there, right, is because, women may be able to signal things that people like better than men. For example, maybe they're able to signal change and novelty, or maybe they're able to signal moral integrity, because we think of women as like being pure and honest mothers or whatever. So maybe because of these stereotypes, which we always thought sort of limited women's political ambitions, maybe parties sometimes have a reason to back women because they want to convey these kinds of traits and these ideas. So that's sort of what the article is about. And then looking at these different political parties that were pretty different, in Latin America, and why would they go for a woman? And because every time you go for a woman, that means you're not going for a man. And that means that some dude who wanted to be nominated by this major political party has to lose. And that's not always fun. So it's really hard to remove men from those positions, in a sense, and to make space for women. And parties need really, really strong reasons for doing so. They need multiple reasons for doing so. Not just that she has a lot of experience, that she has the credentials, but she has to be way better than the men in terms of conveying these attributes, conveying these traits.
Or you can have institutional incentives, like in the case of Brazil, where parties get more money for women candidates, right? So we had, I was looking here, we had 4 women candidates this year, and then Simone Tebet got 3rd place with 5%, which may seem inconsequential because she's not going to run for the 3rd round, but she's going to be a very important player into defining the 2nd round, and she's from a major party. So that's an interesting case of a candidate who probably had no chance of winning, but is a pivotal player into the negotiation process that's going to go on later, right? So yeah, so it's super interesting. I think like, we're kind of same generation of researchers, and we research similar things. And I do see like this move where we came in, many of us came in really focused, looking at institutions, looking at women. And then now there are also more women getting elected, and more women, there's more data on women in general and candidates. So we're looking not just the success, but also looking at, like for you, the almost success, and I'm moving towards a failure. Like, why are so many women getting so few votes in Brazil, right? And I think it's, in that itself also, I feel like it also brings men in a way that earlier research, even our earlier research, doesn't address as much. So again, bringing this dynamic of gender as this institution that constrain and encourages certain behaviors for men and women, right? So it opens up the possibility of looking at research in different ways. It's again, of course, we're nerd out about our very specific research area here, right? But I think it opens up for, when thinking about gender for men and for women too. It's a very important message, to keep kind of repeating to students and to scholars in general.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, how do women win the presidency? Well, how do men do it? Well, men do it differently from women too, because they can use military credentials. Okay. So in the US, there's many military heroes who became president. And then in Latin America as well, Juan Perón, Hugo Chavez, Bolsonaro, women have never become president using their military credentials or becoming big time business people. Big time, for example, the previous president in Chile, a billionaire businessman. Other presidents in Latin America have also used their business and wealth to get political office, and that rarely happens for women. The best way to get women elected is to make it a rule, to make it have gender quotas, have some kind of institutions to basically force political parties to nominate women. And but for the presidency, that's been really hard. And so we have to be like you were saying, like creative, institutionally, I think, ways to incentivize parties to nominate women.
I got about 5 more minutes. I'm gonna let the students, and again, this can be questions about Chile's constitution, questions about the reading, or just questions about political science in general. So I'll let hopefully one or two more questions for Catherine.
Yeah, I want to pipe in here. So one of my questions is are you working on any current research that you are excited about or curious to see like where it's going? Basically, do you have any ongoing research projects? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, my main research project is related to the article that you guys read. So I'm writing a book on how women win presidential elections. And similar to the idea in the article, is one of the main arguments is that, the real barrier, the real thing you have to think about, how women win the presidency is how to become nominees of these major parties. And so, the book looks at the region of Latin America. The book is on, how do women win the Latin American presidency? But a lot of the arguments you could use for any kind of presidentialist regime. And the arguments could also be used to understand Hillary Clinton, why the Democratic Party nominated her. We already know a lot about why she lost. There's a lot of literature on why she lost. But we have to understand too how Hillary Clinton, for example, won the nomination of the Democratic Party. That was a huge feat. Now, some people would say, oh, it's because she had so much experience. That's true. Oh, it's because she's so credentialed. That's true. But there's been other women, right, with a lot of experience, a lot of credentials that haven't been able to do that. So how was she able to do that, in that particular moment? And so, one of the arguments that would come from this book applying to her is thinking about what was it about the Democratic Party that made them really want to elect, to promote descriptive representation, to elect the first woman president. There's a lot of feminists in the Democratic Party in the US. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm for this first time. For the first time, we elected an African-American man. Now we're going to break a barrier and elect the first woman president. So understanding the sort of incentives that the Democratic Party had in terms of what I would view as novelty. Okay, we're going to break down a barrier again. I think it's important understanding the US as well. But the book, looks to understand, how did Michelle Bachelet win the Concertacion's nomination and how did she become the nominee of this major the incumbent coalition? How did Dilma Rousseff do that, in Brazil? Why would Lula, go with Dilma Rousseff instead of another guy who would have more political capital? And then also thinking about, why do parties nominate women, but then they lose as well? Why do these women lose? And so thinking about why women and men may lose in similar ways, in different ways as well. So that's mostly what I'm working on. And some of my other research sort of looks at gender and men presidential candidates. So we ran a survey in Chile for this last presidential election, trying to understand gendered perceptions of these two guys, okay? And how people's different gendered personalities influence their vote choice. Like, did more feminine people with feminine personalities, they go for Boric, this presidential candidate with a feminine leadership style? Did people with more masculine personalities go for this more authoritarian, top-down leader, Jose Antonio Cast? How do people's views on their own feminist identities influence their vote when they're faced with two men candidates? And how do they perceive these man candidates in different gendered ways? So, one of the reasons that men are able to maintain, presidential power is because they're able to convey these traits that are actually sort of associated with women. So men can be novel. For example, Donald Trump says, I'm this new candidate coming out of nowhere, and I'm going to drain the swamp, and Washington is so corrupt. I'm not corrupt. So he's able to make these claims of moral integrity using his masculinity and sort of this outsider status, which is supposed to be, what women are better at. And men can often win making those arguments. Men can often win by, being the empathetic candidate with his horizontal leadership style. So just for example, Bill Clinton, I feel your pain. Men, and Lula is a good example of that too. Men from the left often tend to be pretty good at this, populist men as well. So men have this whole range of ways that they can use their gender to convey these traits that voters want. And so I have another project that's focused more on looking at men candidates and voter preferences as well in presidential elections. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reyes-Householder, for joining us today. I think it was really a great overview of the Chilean situation right now. It really connects in so many ways to how the class is also going to go from now on.
Okay.
So really good for them to hear from somebody else as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pedro. It was an honor, and you guys were really great with your questions and comments and everything. So thank you for participating.